The night the 11th stranger died on Wesley Calloway's land, the coyotes came down off the rimrock before the body was cold. He heard them first as a single high note, then a second, then a sound like a fence giving way, but it was only the wind moving through dry rabbit brush along the hogback above the creek. He laid the canvas over the man's face and walked the half-mile back to his cabin with his shoulders tight and his hands still smelling of lye soap. 46 years of drifting this high desert, and the land had a way of asking things of him he did not know how to refuse. He had not meant to become the man who buried strangers. He had only meant, the first time, to dig one grave deep enough that the coyotes wouldn't smell it. That had been in a cold January 4 winters back, a woman in a busted wagon and a boy of about 3 frozen in her arms, the team already gone. He'd covered her carefully and set the boy on her chest like he was still nursing, because he'd wanted him to take something with him. He'd marked the grave with a piece of board he'd burned her name into with a brand he kept for the yearlings, and he had not been able, after that, to walk past the next one. Or the next. 3 winters later, he had 11 marked graves in a row on the north slope above the creek, and they were all he had besides the cabin and 2 old horses and the line of corrals his father had laid out before Wesley Calloway was born in the year the railroad pulled through the Dalles. He had stopped measuring what the land cost him, because numbers were not what the land dealt in. The land dealt in mornings, in a body laid down soft and a board set square above it, in whatever was left behind. The cabin sat in the long elbow of Pine Creek where the creek bent north and the cottonwoods grew thick enough to break the wind from the canyon mouth. Behind it, the slope climbed in juniper and sage toward a granite shelf the old shepherds called the vertebrae. In front of it, the flat opened out into a wide hay meadow his father had irrigated with a ditch he had dug by hand in '74 and which Wesley had mended every spring since, with the same pointed shovel, the same patience. The woodpile was stacked in a way that looked careless until you counted. 3 rows high, 16 cords, season for season. The well was stone-lined, deep, and the bucket came up cold enough to make your teeth ache. The spring box behind the kitchen smelled of wet clay in August and produced water that tasted like the chalk of the rimrock. These were the things he knew the way he knew the scar on his left palm from the year the irons had spooked. If you were listening tonight with your hands busy, knitting, cooking, supper on the stove, a kettle on the hob, the kind of evening you save for the stories that ask nothing of you, tell me, when we get to the end, where you were when you heard it. I would like to know. He set the 11th stranger's grave beside the 10th, and he thought about the woman. She had been the one whose name was burned into the first board. He thought about the boy. Then he gathered what she'd left inside the canvas sack she'd been clutching when he found her. A pressed tin of coffee beans half full, a folded piece of bleached muslin, and a recipe written in a small, precise hand. German he could not read, but the shapes of the words and the numbers beside them were clear enough that he had learned, by trial, that the bread she meant was meant to last a winter. He baked that bread the next cold morning and stood at the stove with the kitchen smelling of caraway, and he understood for the first time that the people he buried were not endings. They were bequests. They were quiet inheritances, like the salt left in a kettle by a grandmother, like seeds saved from one harvest to keep the next. The next stranger to die on his land, in the gray of a March thaw, was a Chinese man who had been walking since the railroad work shut down further west. He had come in from the south with a cotton coat that had gone gray and a small leather pouch around his neck with a chipped piece of jade inside it. He had not spoken English Wesley could make out. He had spoken 3 words Wesley remembered: long, cold, thank. And then he had sat by the fire for 2 nights and a morning and had died without complaint. The pouch went into Wesley's pocket, and a folded slip of paper came out of it with the names of plants and what they cured. Wesley Calloway could not read that paper either, but in the years that followed he used those plants: chamomile for the gut, willow for the pain, mugwort for the fever that comes on slow at night. And once he had to ride 12 miles in the snow to a homestead where a woman was dying of milk fever, and the mugwort brew pulled her back from the place she was going. She gave him a quilt for it, even though he had not asked. The quilt smelled, for years, of cedar. After her, a widow with a daughter of 7 came down the wagon track with a bag of dried beans she'd carried clear from Nebraska. She did not last the winter. The cough that had been sitting on her came open, and the daughter sat beside her on the pallet holding her hand, and the daughter did not cry, because children in that country learned not to cry before they learned to read. The beans went into the ground that May, and they came up as the best pole beans anyone in the canyon had ever grown. Wesley sold seed from that harvest to 3 ranchers downriver for 3 winters, and the money bought lumber for a proper root cellar, with bins for the carrots and bins for the turnips, and a corner where the milk kept cool in a stone crock. Then there was a schoolteacher from Missouri who lost his way in a blizzard and came into the cabin with ice in his beard and books he had carried in a leather satchel. He was a slow man with a soft southwestern voice and a habit of saying sir to people who had never been called sir. He died 2 weeks later of a wound in his side gone sour, and Wesley had not known to lance it until too late, and he remembered that every time a stranger came after. He left behind the satchel 9 books, a writing pen with a copper nib he sharpened on a whetstone, and a leather journal in which he had kept the proper forms for how a man writes a deed, a claim, a bill of sale, a letter that has weight in a courtroom. Wesley Calloway had never known that such forms existed. He learned them by copying them in his own hand, line by line, on winter nights when the cabin was so quiet he could hear the cottonwood leaves drop. A black cowboy from Texas came in summer, riding a paint horse that picked up a stone and went lame near the creek. His name was Ezekiel Pruitt, and he had shouldered 1,000 head of beef between the Brazos and the Canadian and had a way of talking to horses that made them go where he meant. He stayed 3 months, helped with the hay, and one morning told Wesley, by way of coffee, that the outfit he had worked for had run him off for looking sideways at the wrong white man in '79, and that he had not been back south since. He left a saddle blanket the pattern of which Wesley had never seen, red and black and bone white in a diamond running the length of it, and a method for carding wool into clean, even rolls, and the knowledge that 20 pounds of clean roving would fetch more than 20 pounds of dirty fleece. That winter, Wesley sheared his own sheep for the first time in his life and earned enough at the trading post to mend a stretch of fence 2 miles long and to put a tin roof on the cabin at last. A mail-order bride whose husband had died on the trail arrived at the cabin in the fall with a tin trunk and a velvet ribbon the color of dried blood and a wedding ring too big for her finger. Her name was Ruth. She was 22. She died of heartbreak and cold and not enough of anything before the first snow, and the last thing she said, to nobody, was the name of a town in Ohio. The ribbon went around the neck of a small wooden horse a drifter girl had carved in exchange for bread and a place by the fire. The girl was 9, and her name Wesley never learned. She left the horse on the table one morning and was gone by the time he woke up. He kept the horse on his mantle all the years after. He kept the ribbon around its neck, and the horse turned, slowly, in a draft Wesley never noticed, so that the ribbon caught the light from different angles at different hours. It is not the people who live longest that change a place. It is the people who rest there. Do you remember the first time in your life you did something that no one had asked you to do, and no one praised you for, and you did it again the next year anyway? Hold that feeling for a moment. We are coming to the part of this story where it begins to matter. The land Wesley Calloway lived on bordered the open range held by Harlan Donner, who owned more cattle than any man in the county and whose word was the same as the county commissioner's, because the county commissioner dined at his table twice a month by unspoken arrangement. Donner had a long mustache he waxed at the tips and a way of smiling like a man who had bought the thing he was looking at. He had been trying for 3 years to buy Wesley out, water rights, graze leases, the whole pie by slow inches, and Wesley would not sell. He would not sell because the cabin was the only place on earth where anyone had ever been buried with a name burned into a board above them by his own hand. He would not sell because the trade he had learned, longer than any other trade, was the trade of laying strangers down with their names attached, and a man cannot carry that trade to a different address. Donner's men came one morning in early October with a writ and a clipboard. The men were polite. They had coffee on the porch. They explained that a county survey had shown the small creek on Wesley's tract to be a tributary of the larger creek on Donner's deed that ran further to the east, and therefore the water rights belonged to Donner, and therefore the land belonged to Donner, and therefore Wesley had 14 days to vacate or to answer a petition the county would file that month in the courthouse at Canyon City. Wesley sat on the porch after they left and looked out at the slope with the 11 marked graves. He thought about the widow and the beans and the cabin root cellar she had paid for. He thought about the schoolteacher's journal and the forms inside it. He thought about the velvet ribbon around the wooden horse and the man whose name was Abel Marsh who had come in January looking for something the fever would not let him find. He thought about how many times, in his life, men with writs and coffee had come to men with cabins, and the cabin had always lost. The next morning he rode down the canyon to the trading post, where a man who knew a man who knew a man could read German, could put the schoolteacher's words into English. The baker who had come west in '79 was there, and he read aloud the recipe, and then he read the line beside it and stopped. The line said, in plain understandable English, "For Johannes, when he comes home from the field." Wesley Calloway had been baking that bread for 4 winters on the morning of his own grief and had never known who Johannes was. He had been baking, all those winters, a piece of someone else's home. That same week, an old Norwegian homesteader, Olaf Tveiten, came in from the high country with his daughter, and she'd been taken by a fever that the willow bark would not break. Wesley made the mugwort brew he had learned from the Chinese man and put it on the girl's lips every hour through the night, and the hours broke him open, because if you have heard a young person breathe wrong and then breathe right again, you have heard something you cannot unhear. She lived. Olaf repaid him by teaching him, patiently, across 3 afternoons, to work flax, how to break it, how to scutch it, how to heckle the long fibers until they gleamed, and how to twist a clean length of binder twine from the woody core. That winter Wesley harvested enough rye to bind into sheaves with his own twine, and the straw was so good, and the twine so even that the mill at Canyon City paid double, and the double bought a proper iron hinge for the cabin door. Then came the 12th stranger, in a January so bitter that a man should have been anywhere else. He was a former preacher named Abel Marsh, and he had lost his wife in a town 2 counties over and his faith along with her, and he walked the desert that winter because he did not know where else to walk. He came into Wesley's cabin and slept by the fire for 3 days and asked only for water. He died on the 4th night with Wesley's hand on his shoulder, and the only sound was the cottonwood leaves dropping in the cold. He left behind a Bible with his wife's name, Ruth, the same name as the mail order bride, although another Ruth entirely, pressed inside the front cover, and a single sentence the preacher had been quoting to himself for 30 years. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Wesley did not know what the sentence meant, exactly, but he copied it into the schoolteacher's journal beside the legal forms and felt his hand steady as he did, and he believed the steadiness was the meaning. By that spring, Wesley had 13 graves on the slope. He had not counted them that way, but a man who came down from the high country to file mineral claims stopped at the cabin for water and counted them himself and said, out loud, 13. Then he said, "My God, man, what is this?" Wesley said, "People who died on my land." The man looked at him a long moment. He was a former veteran of the war in Mexico, and he had a copper kettle strapped to his saddle and a way of doing things with beans and bacon that kept a man warm through a cold morning. He stayed through the planting, and he left behind the kettle and a method for soaking beans in cold brine overnight, so they cooked faster and tasted fuller, and he taught Wesley to skim the foam when they came to the boil, because the foam was where the wind of the field lived. That summer Wesley fed the brined beans to every rider who passed through, and 3 of those riders came back the next month with their wives to trade for seed and stay for supper. And one of those wives, a quiet woman with a high forehead, sat on the porch with Wesley in the evening and said, "I would not have believed a man alone could hold this much together." She did not say how he had come by it. The 13th stranger was Lillian Marsh, who came down the wagon road in the heat of August on a thin sorrel mare leading 1 pack mule, a buckboard rattling behind with her husband Henry propped against the seat. Henry had lasted longer than she had expected and then not lasted the day. He died at the kitchen table with his hat still on, and Lillian sat with him through the night, and in the morning asked Wesley to bury him beside the others, and the way she asked carried with it the specifics of a woman who had driven a wagon 400 miles on a road that did not exist. She was 51 that summer, and she had not cried since her son died in '76, and she did not cry now. The grief was somewhere deeper. Henry, before he died, had signed over to her a deed for 20 acres on the south slope that adjoined Wesley's tract. The deed was proper, witnessed, recorded at the county seat, and Lillian owned that land the moment her husband was in the ground. The gift of it was not a thing she had earned. The gift of it was a thing Henry had paid for, on his way out, with the last thing he had to spend, which was his care for the woman he had taken in marriage in '69 and could not, in the end, take out of it. Wesley Calloway took the deed from her hand and walked it to the schoolteacher's journal and copied the wording word for word and prepared his answer. And the answer was patience, and the answer was the truth. But the patience would have to be coaxed into shape like flax into twine. What is the harder choice? It is not the one between good and evil. It is not the one between courage and fear. The harder choice is the one between holding what you love as a quiet thing and stepping forward to claim it in front of men who would rather you did not. The petition came down that fall. Donner rode in himself this time, with 2 riders trailing him. He had a smile like a man who had bought the thing he was looking at. He said, "Wesley, I'm sorry, but the creek is mine." He set the writ on the table. He said, "You have a week, and a man who has a wife has more to lose than a man who does not." And he left the word wife in the room like a coal. That evening Wesley did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the schoolteacher's journal open and the velvet ribbon around the wooden horse and a candle burning down to the brass. He thought about the letter the German woman had carried in her sack, the note by her husband's name. He thought about the receipt for the tin roof that Ezekiel's shearing pattern had bought him. He thought about the embroidered initial on the quilt that smelled of cedar. He thought about the salt and flour biscuit recipe the preacher's wife had penciled onto the back flyleaf of the Bible. He thought about all the things people had given him because they could not take them with them, and the way the land made a kind of museum of the living. He sent a letter to Canyon City by way of the rider who came through every Tuesday morning with mail from the stage at the Dallas. The letter was written in the proper form the schoolteacher had taught him. It told the truth of the watercourse. It named the witness who had surveyed it in '68 and who still lived east of Mt. Vernon. It cited, with the help of the journal, the case law the schoolteacher had underlined in 3 different colors on the page that fell open most often. It said, in language any lawyer could read, that the tributary in question was, in fact, a snowmelt runoff that lost itself in the Alkali Flats 8 miles east of Donner's deed and never touched Donner's Creek at all. He did not send the letter alone. He sent it with the bag of last year's seed beans, in trade, and 10 pounds of the clean wool Ezekiel's pattern had taught him to card, and the loaf of German bread the recipe had made possible. The writer, who was a man named Curtis and who had been raised in a courthouse town in Missouri, took the gifts and spread through the post office in Canyon City the news that the man up on the north slope with 13 graves had his house in order and his papers clean and his beans in the cellar. Curtis did this because Curtis had lost his brother to a claim jump in '83 and had been waiting for a man with a clean letter in his hand. The letter was not a gift of the dead to Wesley alone. It was a gift of the dead, by way of Wesley, to the whole country around him that wanted a yes to look like a yes. The reply came back by the next writer, in November, with the first snow sitting on the saddle blanket. The petition was denied, with the county commissioner's own signature, and the denial named the letter, named the witness, named the case, and there was nothing Harlan Donner could do about it. There were men in Canyon City who had been waiting to say no to Donner for 10 years and lacked either the language or the nerve. Wesley had given them both, and the language was more than half the gift. When the second rider came through that winter, January again, the cruel month, Lillian took the fever. It was not the milk fever. It was the older fever, the one the Chinese man had known, the one mugwort could break. Wesley made the brew. Lillian held the cup with 2 hands and asked who had taught him this, and he said, a man. She did not ask more. She lived, and in the spring she moved out of the tent behind the cabin and into the cabin proper, and on a morning in early April, he found her braiding the drifter girl's wooden horse's mane with the velvet ribbon from the mail-order bride. She was humming. He did not interrupt her. He stood at the window and watched, and the feeling in his chest was not a new feeling. It was an old feeling, finally permitted, like a door swung open in a house that had been waiting for someone to unlock it. Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you while you're busy doing something else. Lillian asked him, that summer, why he had buried so many strangers. He said he did not know. She said, yes, you do. She said, you couldn't leave them to the coyotes. He looked at her for a long time and said nothing, because she had said it for him, and there was nothing to add to that. He went out to the kitchen and set the kettle to boil for the brined beans, because she had said it for him, and someone had to do the next small thing, and it was never going to be him with the words. Donner's men did not come back that year. They did not come back the next. The writ was denied twice more by the time Donner understood that Wesley had the proper forms and the proper witnesses and the kind of slowness that wears a powerful man down a fraction of a season at a time. The way the creek had cut its bend into the basalt over the years before Wesley's father came to it. He sold his northern range to a younger outfit in '87 and wrote, by his own hand, a single line at the bottom of the deed that read, with the kind of reluctant respect a man pays when he has been outlasted, Wesley Calloway, who was here when I arrived, and will be here when I am gone. That line went into the schoolteacher's journal on the page after the case law, and Lillian found it years later when she was cleaning the cabin, and she read it out loud to herself, and then again, and put it back where it had been. The Bible the preacher had left was on the windowsill in the morning when Lillian read from it. Lillian kept the bookkeeping in the schoolteacher's journal and the currency notes in the Bible's back pages, because that was where she felt safe, and she counted them twice and 3 times because Henry had been careless with money in life, and she would not be careless with money in his absence. The cabin, in those autumn evenings, smelled of caraway and wood smoke and the dry, clean scent of sage a native woman had left, years before, on the threshold in a tight bundle she'd tied with a length of her own hair and a strip of bark, and the sage still carried its small gift of memory in the house. 2 years went by. The 13 graves on the north slope had small boards above each one, marked with the names Wesley had been able to learn and the ones he had not. And for the ones he had not, he carved the seasons instead: January, March, May, June, August, so that the wind knew when to come around them. He planted sage around them, and the sage held the wind back. He made a fence of the flax twine around the whole plot, 3 strands high with a cedar post at every corner hewn by his own axe. And the fence was the kind that does not sag. Then, on a morning in late June, the 12th rider who had passed through in any year came down the canyon with news that the county had annexed the high slope to Donner's successor and would begin the survey for a wagon road the following spring. The road would go through the eastern edge of Wesley's plot. Lillian heard it before Wesley did, because Lillian was the one who had been listening to the riders for years, and she had already copied, in the schoolteacher's hand, the petition to delay the survey. Wesley rode down to Canyon City the next morning with the petition and the Bible and the deeds and the journal, and he sat in the office of the man who read law, and he laid them out one at a time, beginning with Henry's deed for Lillian's 20 acres and ending with the case law from the schoolteacher's page that fell open most often. The lawyer, a young man, 26, who had lost his own mother to a wagon accident on a road 3 winters back, read the letters in the journal. He read the witness statement. He set his pen down and said, "Mr. Calloway, the women and the men you buried have given me everything I need." He did not charge for it. He did not charge for it because he noticed, in the journal, the recipe of a mother he had lost, in the same hand and the same spices. Lillian kept her hand on his arm in the saddle on the way home, and she did not let go until they were at the gate, and Wesley did not ask her to, and the not asking was the largest kindness the year held. June slid into July, and the sage on the graves was in bloom. They sat on the porch that evening and watched the light come down the slope in long bars through the junipers, and the cabin was warm behind them, and the kettle was on. Lillian had a coffee cup in her hand, and the coffee was from the same press tin the German woman had carried in her canvas sack 2 winters before it should have been empty. Wesley said, "I do not get how this last tin keeps." Lillian said, "That is because we keep using a spoonful at a time." He looked at the tin. He understood. The kitchen had 2 cups in it now, where it had had 1. The pantry had a small jar of mugwort under the second shelf, marked in Lillian's handwriting. The mantel had the wooden horse with the ribbon. The bread was baked weekly, the beans brined 3 nights out of 4. Lillian had begun to mend Wesley's shirts without being asked to, and he had begun to leave the porch lamp on a half-hour longer on nights she came back from the trading post. The epilogue is small and short. 8 years after Lillian Marsh came down the wagon road to bury her husband, she was still there. She was still on the porch on summer evenings with the wooden horse on the windowsill, the velvet ribbon braided into its mane, the Bible open on her knee to the page where the 2 Ruths met. Wesley was mending a stretch of fence down by the creek with twine from his own flax, and the twine was clean and even and did not snap when he tested it the way he always tested it. The 13 graves on the north slope had sage around them and small boards, and a young woman who had come up from Canyon City with a daughter of 7 was kneeling at the 11th grave, the one with the pressed tin's recipe burned into the board beside it, planting a row of caraway in the turned earth, because she had been told the bread that came from that seed would last through the winter, and she wanted it to. A cloud moved across the sun. The air smelled of caraway and warm pine and the breath of cattle somewhere down the meadow. Wesley straightened and looked at the slope, and Lillian looked too, and they did not speak, because there was nothing to add to the way the land looked with all the dead in their places and the living sitting on the porch and the seeds of the next season already going into the ground. The wooden horse on the windowsill turned, slowly, in the long draft. If this story stayed with you somewhere quiet tonight, somewhere between the bread and the wooden horse, I would be grateful for a like, and for the company of a subscription so the next one finds you the same way. Next time we will ride the High Line with a young widow on a cattle drive across the Montana line in 83 who sees a man hanging from a telegraph pole with a card pinned to his chest, and she cuts him down before the posse can arrive. I think you are going to want to be there for what she finds in his coat. Wherever you are tonight, thank you for sitting with this. Sleep warm.